Today we'd like to talk about cycles, and cycles are actually based upon numbers. And so first we're going to talk a little bit about numbers and what numbers are, because we find that many people don't understand mathematics because no one ever taught them the rudiments. It's very simple, and yet they think it's so simple that they don't teach it, perhaps, or who knows why. But anyway, perhaps they do nowadays, but they didn't when I was growing up. And the numbers are basically, you have count. It's a count of something. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 items, whatever they are, 5 bushels of wheat, or 5 ears of corn, or 6 apples. So that's count, and that's how numbers started off, with counting. And on the opposite side, you have numbers that are used for measurement, and that's a bit different when you're measuring something. And we'll get to that in a little bit, the difference, because that's very important, the difference between the two. And so when we're talking about cycles, we're talking about count, the count of the cycles. And so a count, actually, when you're counting, there's 2 aspects of count. And one is called cardinal, which is just basically you're counting numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so forth. And the other aspect of that is the ordinal. It's called ordinal numbers. Ordinal just means that there's an order to them. And so you say first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. When there's an overlap between the ordinals and the cardinals, then we know that when we say, for example, the first cycle, that's the same thing as saying that's cycle number 1, or the second cycle, that's cycle number 2, third cycle, cycle number 3, because there's a one-to-one correspondence between first and being a count of 1, and the second cycle being a count of 2. There's a one-to-one correspondence, 1 to first, 2 to second, 3 to third. And now ordinal numbers can have more than that. You can have, like, first place at a fair, at a county fair. You could have the best apple pie. Okay, so you get first place, second place, and third place, and that's ordered. It's their ranks, and then you might have honorable mention, but they don't necessarily tell you how many contestants there are, or anything like that. It's just a matter of rank. And it might be, like, for example, honorable mentions. In that rank, you might have more than one, so it's more than a one-to-one correspondence. Yeah, first place, a one-to-one correspondence. First place, highest rank. Second place, 1, next highest rank. Or there could even be ties, so sometimes you have 2 in a particular category. In an honorable mention, sometimes you have several. So So when we're talking about cycles, we're talking about the cardinality of it and the ordinality in a one-to-one correspondence. When we apply cycles to dates, now we're bringing measurement into the picture. So that, what exactly is measurement? Now measurement measurement has 2 things. It has boundaries, and it has proportionality. Now, what do we mean by boundaries? By boundaries means that if you're going to measure something, you have to have a starting place, and that starting place is 0. We know it as 0, or if you're counting, it's a none. But when you're counting, you normally don't start with 0, 1, 2, 3, 5, because there's no need to. You just say there's 1 apple, 2 apple, 3 apple, 4 apple. So you're counting 1, 2, 3, 4. And so where do you start with counting numbers? You start with 1. And that's what we would do with cycles. The first cycle, the second cycle, the third cycle, the fourth cycle. But when we're measuring, Because if we say, well, a cycle ran from 1849 to 1850, summer 1849 to summer of 1850, June solstice 49 to June solstice 1850. Well, that's 1 year. So, so now what you're doing is you're measuring. Now, when you measure, the other thing that you have to have with the proportion, you have to have unit, because when you measure by units, how many units of something. And so you can measure how many apples are in a bushel. Okay, you count out the apples, and then you know how many apples are in a bushel. And if the bushel is only half full, you can know how many apples that is. That's a proportionality, 1/2 compared to the full thing. So that's the proportionality part of measurement. You can get whole numbers and then a part of a number, and or it's partly filled. Something is partly filled. That's measurement. And so, but measurement starts with a 0. You can't start with year 1. You start with year 0, your base. And so, for Cosmin, in the Cosmin era, 1849, June solstice 1849, we take as the beginning of the Cosmin era. And so the year that runs from June 1849 to June 1850, that is year 0. It's not year 1. Actually, it is year 1 if you're counting. Yes, it's the first year. But if you're measuring, we say, well, that's year 0. Because if you start on a timeline and work forward from the timeline, you can't start with year 1. I'll show you an example here in this chart. Now, in this chart, over here, we have, this is a chart of light and darkness for the first 200 years of the Cosmin era. And we'll note over here that this line here, this vertical line, up here is light and below is darkness. And these are the measures of light as a millage. And a millage is like percentage, only it's out of 1,000. And so it goes up by increments of 100, 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, 600. And it goes down into darkness, that many, 600. And that's all that was necessary for this to show the first 200 years of Cosmin cycle. But the point we were making right now, though, is you have to start with year 0, and then you go out to the first measure, and that first measure that we see there is 5. 5 AK, mean Anno Cosmin, the 5th year of Cosmin, 5th year basically after Cosmin. And so what the measure does is it starts with 0, and you finish the first 5 years. That's the measure of the first 5 years is 5 years. It takes 5 years, but the reason that you do it that way is because then you start with your base year, which is 1849, and then you just subtract that. You subtract whatever year you're looking at, you subtract 1849 from it to find what year you're talking about. Let's take another look at this chart here, because if we start over here at 0, and then we go in 10 years, and so we look up here to see where that first dip bottomed out at, and that was exactly at 10 years. And so that's 1859, that 10-year mark. And so you say, well, what year was that? It was AK10. That was Anno Cosmin, the year of Cosmin. Anno means year. Year of Cosmin 10. So that was year 10 of Cosmin. So that's where it is here on the chart, because we're measuring years. This is a measurement. And so if we would have started with 1849 as being the first year, and it is the first year, 1849 to 1850, summer of 1849 to summer 1850 is the first year as you live it. But it isn't called the first year until after you've completed the first year. It's the same thing with birthdays. How old are you when you're 25? Well, when you reach your 25th birthday, what that means is you've just completed your 25th year. You're actually starting the next day, or even the next moment after 25 years after your birth. So you're actually starting 26th year after your birth. You're starting that at the moment 25 years later. You're actually starting on the 26th, but they say you're 25 years old, and this is where proportionality comes in. So you're 25 years old and 1 minute afterwards. And so it's the same with a child. Now, a child is born, they don't say, well, the child is 0 years old. But until that child reaches his first birthday, he is known by months or weeks, even if they're a newborn. 3 weeks old, 5 weeks old, 6 weeks old, 2 months old, 8-month-old baby. But then when they get to a year old, then they say a year and 2 months or a year and a half. So they go proportionality again. But just in general, when people say, well, okay, how old is he? How old is your child? Well, he is a year old, or he's 2 years old, or he's 3, or he's 4, meaning he's past that birthday, and he's actually, if he's 4 years old, meaning he's experiencing his 5th yearly cycle. And so when we talk about cycles this way, we have to translate, when we talk about cycles, we have to translate the year, we have to translate that back into cycles. Because when a person is 4 years old, they reach their 4th birthday, that means they've completed 4 cycles, 4 yearly cycles. And they're starting their 5th yearly cycle. What we're interested in cycles is not the measure, not the measure of the year, where it is, and the units that we're using in the measure, in this case is years. We want to know during the time that he's experiencing his 5th cycle, his 5th year, we want to know what it is or when that time is, we should say, when that time is, and can judge accordingly. If we're going to use cycles for prophecy work, then we can. Now, I'm using really simple examples, but when we look at historical events and we talk about cycles in historical events, then we have to translate the dates into which cycle is man undergoing, because every cycle is different. Every cycle has a different meaning to it. Well, what are the meanings of the cycles? Well, the meanings of the cycles are actually found in the Tablet of Simoin. Now, the Tablet of Simoin, which is in Oahspi's Book of Sappha, and now the Tablet of Simoin was first given to man approximately 72,000 years ago, given to the Ihuns. And it was the first comprehensive explanation of the universe. And so it had to be well ordered, well structured, and it had to have sufficient depth, because they understood that this tablet was going to be resurfaced at this time of Cosman, and it did through Oahspe. And so in the Tablet of Simoin it still has to be pertinent to today, and it is. It explains reality. It's a comprehensive explanation of reality as being basically made up of 11 cycles. Of 11 cycles of 11 cycles. 11 times 11, 121 separate steps, if you will, or separate entities, or separate conditions, separate realities that are in creation that we have to deal with, and an explanation of how the universe proceeds. And so if we look at the first row of 11, and there's 11 rows and 11 units in each row, so each 11, now 11 is very important in dealing with cycles. And we'll get to why in just in the course of this talk, but it's based on the unit. What's the unit? Because even though we're counting, yes, we can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 symbols in Samoin. Yeah, we start with the first one, and then second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th, 11th. And so to somebody who hasn't studied into it, yes, it might just seem like they're just randomly picked concepts, but they're more than that. They're not just randomly picked. They're well ordered. They're structured around the reality of our universe, of our creation that we're in. And so the first one is is the foundation. Now, the foundation, when we were teaching Asu, meaning the humanity as angels, because we live on when we lose our corporeal body, we continue living in spirit, and we eventually rise up and join all those other one-time mortals who are now in light, and we progress onward and upward. And so, and there's no end to it. That's the testimony that we have. It's eternal progression, ever more comprehensive. But we have to start somewhere, and where we start is with the foundation, the Now the is going forth. It's an active thing, a male attribute, as it were, compared to the feminine or receptive, which will come next, and that's the second attribute. But the first attribute, the going forth, is the foundation. And so in giving this to early man, because his intellect, he could comprehend things, but it had to be within the context of his milieu, within the context of his environment that was filled with creatures of all sorts, and carnivores, and all manner of creeping things, as Olaspi says, besides other people as well. So in teaching the Samoin concepts to man, they had to relate to man as he was then, and something that he could easily relate to. So if we say is the foundation, we are basically talking about from the corporeal point of view, from the mortal man point of view. If you look out and you can see the ground in front of you, and that's like a foundation. It stretches out like the symbol. It's just, you look at there's a horizon line out there. There it is. There's your And so it came to be known as earth, or the ground. So this word then becomes the foundation. It means foundation. The sound. Now when Samoin was given, the beauty of Samoin is that the sounds that were given with Samoin are the soul sounds. Because man, even though he didn't understand the soul and all that way back then, he still could hear the soul. He could still react to the soul. He could still perceive, listen, and hear the soul, what the soul said regarding certain things, the sounds that the soul made as it came to his ears, and so he would express those. And when he looked out and he said, that's the soul form, the foundation. So that when we look at cycles, the first cycle, which is not a zero cycle, it's the foundation cycle, very first cycle. So for a child, it would be from his birth until the first year, or it would have been if we're looking at years, and we're going to predict or prophecy with regarding years, then the first year, the foundation year would be from 1849, summer of 1849, June solstice 1849, to the June solstice of 1850. And that's our foundation year, our foundation cycle. Now the foundation lays the foundation for everything. Everything that's built up from this foundation becomes, in a way, the responsibility of whoever it is that laid out that foundation. Because that's the way that Jehovah made his creation with regard to responsibility. And so if you make a foundation, it doesn't have to be a physical foundation. It can be a mental foundation. It can be a spiritual foundation. It could be an emotional foundation. It could be a project, the foundation of a project. Doesn't matter. Cycles can be applied to anything. And so if you have a project that you're starting, you lay the foundation for it. And that always comes first. Always the foundation comes first. And how that foundation is laid out will determine, you see, the things that are built from it. And anything that's built from it, if we build it correctly, then good will come out of that. That's because we're sowing good, and so and depending upon how closely it resembles the structure of the universe, how close it is to Jehovah, in other words, then the more enduring is the foundation. And the thing we have to keep in mind is not all foundations are long enduring, and we know that. It seems rather obvious to say that, but some foundations are meant to be just only temporary. So for example, when the angels come, the Etherian angels, to deliver man during a Danhei, the dawn of Danhei, the start of the 3,000 year cycle, and they will during the 5 or 7 years or so that they're there, they will lay a foundation for that entire Danhei cycle. Sometimes when they're laying the foundation, it's not only for the foundation for that Danhei cycle, but for the square, which has to do with the density, the ethi density, and it has to do with, and it's comprised of 4 cycles. And that's 12,000 years, which then we also know is an era. And that can also be shown on a chart. And as a matter of fact, if you, a lot of these things were taught to man, especially through the Dark Ages. This information was kept alive through whatever means was available for them to keep the information alive. Well, this with the 12, that came. We know that from the zodiac, from the Ankh, as Owaspy Samoan calls it, which is number 49, and we won't get anywhere near that number here today. But the Ankh is divided into 12 houses, 12 sections, 12 units, and 12 is very important. 12 is the next step. It's the first start of the repeat of that 11. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Boom, 12. 12 is man. Woo! And then man goes through that row. Well, there's meanings for all these things and their positions and all that stuff, and they're all connected together with cycles. Any cycle. Because what happens with the foundation is you lay your foundation, and so anything that comes from that foundation, then, as we mentioned, whoever lays it out has to be responsible for what comes forth from that foundation, to the extent that Jehovah holds them to that by his light within. And for those who serve Jehovah, that's great, because that's marvelous, that's wonderful, because his responsibility, as it says in Owaspy, and I'll just maybe paraphrase, but it's like the weight of a fly on the shoulder. It's very little. It's as far as the weight of it that you feel, but it's a joy. Because labor itself is a joy when we rise up beyond the beast in particular. Because the spirit grows by giving away, it grows by labor, from laboring. And it becomes a joy and a rest to actually labor. And that actually pertains to number 13, which is the next number after man, this is part of the explanation of how the universe works. But we have to start with the first row, which has to do with the foundation. And by the way, before we move on, we would like to mention about how the foundation, it says in Oahspe, well, it was sort of warned, to people, well, kind of avoid if you can numbers 1, 11, 66 and 666, because those are the numbers of the beast, or it's difficult to deal with, the difficult numbers to deal with. And the reason that 1 is so difficult to deal with is because foundations are extremely difficult. A good foundation, extremely difficult to lay out a good foundation. It's you have to put a lot of effort into it. Anybody knows that who's done a project. But regardless of what the foundation is, if we create a foundation, then we become responsible for things that are built from that foundation. And so that's why we always take caution with the foundation, which is number 1, the first thing, the awe. And so, and that's what Oahspe is good about too, because Oahspe lays the foundation for man in Cosmonera to rise in his rise in his spirit man above the corporeal man. We don't never lose a corporeal man. The corporeal man is there while we're mortal. We're always corporeal, and yet we can experience things in our S and live a life of S at the same time. And it's really not a dichotomy in the sense that it's separate and tugging. It can be, but that's basically in the early stages when man is first trying to rise above and get beyond the beast and all that. But it gets better as a person progresses. Anyway, so we wanted to say that about the foundation, about we always need to take care of the foundation. And also when we go forth, it's always good to build from that foundation. So we're given the foundation, we're told about Jehovah through Oahspe, and how to connect with Jehovah, how to tell light from darkness, how to tell the spirits that come, their grade, and basically we can tell the grade of everyone, and we can progress to being able to do that, and to be able to hear the Creator's voice. This is what it says in Oahspe. That's its purpose, to help man to know of a truth where they're going to be living when they lose this physical body, because you can develop to see spiritually even now, but you have to go through the faithless discipline. This is what Oahspe is about, the faithless discipline. It lays it out, those things that need to get done for the foundation, to build the foundation, to go forward and to rise, to hear the Creator's voice, rise to see the spirit realms and know where we're going to be going, and to read grades and so forth and all that, and to actually feel secure. And because this foundation is the foundation. If we don't feel secure in our foundation, we don't feel secure. And so that's what Saguan, the Black Doubt, deals with. They take advantage of it. Satan takes advantage of this because they look for weaknesses in the foundation. And they don't even look for weaknesses in the foundation. They look for weaknesses in the structure that's built on the foundation. But if need to, they'll go all the way to the foundation, and they all have to be remedied. We have to rise up in light. We have to become like the Vivano of old, the expression of light, an expression of the good. And that way, when we go forth, we go forth in a foundation that's from virtue and cleanliness. This is part of the faithless discipline: cleanliness and purity. All these good things, that's all laid out in Oahspe. The many things that we need to do in order to rise in our spirit to live the type of life which, as faithists, we should be living. Well, I say should be living. We should be living, ideally, in our hopes at least, because at least you want to hope to live, a life of happiness and joy and peace and harmony and glory and beauty and all that stuff. that and affiliation and association and fraternity and the feeling of fulfillment, all that comes about through the faith as discipline, through this foundation that we build, that we go forth in, because the foundation is actually already built. But we have to tune into it. We have to become one with it. We have to adapt ourselves to the foundation, because Jehovah is the foundation. He is going forth, and he lays the foundation. And so to become one with Jehovah, which is the most desirable, because he's all good, everything that's good and the highest best that we can ever attain to thinking about. Jehovah is all those things, and even more comprehensive beyond that, so we can always rise up into greater understanding of the Creator, as we spoke about in some of our earlier videos, or other videos. And so from this foundation, so we're talking about cycles now, any cycle, so the foundation of creation, so it's there, the Ah. And so Ah went forth, and so as I was going forth, I curled around, he rose up, and he saw himself, he got an objective view. The O is the second one in Samoan, the O. You look up, O is comprehension. Comprehension of that which is higher. The sky is what we normally think of when corporeally we look out and we see the sky. Yeah, the sky's up, heaven's up there. So that those became words for sky and heaven and well, initially heaven anyway, and comprehension something, because it's objectivity. The going forth is subjectivity. It's you're just right in it, dealing with it, and so you can't abstract from it and look at it objectively. But with O represents the ability to do that, and in that sense, it's the opposite is introduced, because you can go to the other end here and you can look back and you can objectively see the other end. When you're going forth, you look backwards. You have to look through all your filters and everything, and you can't really look at it objectively or abstractly. But with the O, you can just go from that point and look back, and you go, oh yes, that's where I was, there. Except when it starts getting real close, then it gets more difficult to view objectively. So that's the O, that's the second cycle. And so in a sense, what this means is that the Ah is the foundation, which then, after the foundation is laid, then that gets repeated. It gets repeated on a higher level, which is the O. And so what this means is that the foundation Ah can be found in O, and we'll get to how you can see the foundation from in it. But you can look back and see the foundation. You can look back and see how, because we have the capacity to abstract. That's the part of the O, is this ability to abstract. But it also then introduces opposites, because you have the arc, and you have one end over here and one end over here, or the crescent, one end over here and one end over here, and they're opposites. And you have the male and the female, and you have a hot and cold, and you have light and dark, all these things. And so that all comes about because of the second cycle. And any second cycle that comes forth, this is what happens. We laid the foundation for the project, and then we go forth with it, and we sort of, at some point, we step back and we objectively look to see how it's going, and we can see how it's working out and all that. That's the second cycle. In short, there's a lot of other things. There's a lot of other meanings of the second cycle, because for example, it's taking things to extremes, if you want to think of it in that sense. But it's also working from the foundation to these extremes. And so it's taking something, which is whatever foundation you laid out there, and it's taking that to what it seems to it to be a logical conclusion, or a logical extreme, a logical, so let's take this and see how far we can run with it, kind of thing. And so that all happens during the second cycle. And so if you're looking at the second cycle of anything, you can apply these to that, some of these understandings to that. And so, and you can even do it even in a more abstract sense. So if we think of as the foundation, the going forth, as being all love, a flow of love, the love that's everywhere, that's the foundation, is love. And we can consider then the O that comes as wisdom, the abstraction, the objectivity, and the being able to look down from on high, so to speak. And so, so that correlates with wisdom, associates with wisdom. We could even say that is the basis. That's an explanation of wisdom through the cycles, through the use of cycles. And as it is in Samoin. So we have the O, the A. Well, then there's the third combination. You have the opposites, the father. If the father is the going forth, and it is the male, the masculine, and everybody has this in them, by the way, whether they're a male or a female, they still have the ne aspect, the going forth aspect, and the receptive, the omish aspect, where we receive and perceive, and that's the feminine. And so we all have that. It's just that as our physical bodies go and all that, we have this outer manifestation of the ne, the going forth. If you're a male, if you're a female, you have the outer manifestation of the receptivity, of being omish. And so a person who has that type of body will tend to be, a male will tend to be more going forth, and a female will tend to be more nurturing and receptive and building, in the sense of like this, whereas the male will be out here building, and that can be read or perceived in the cycles of Samoin, in the layout, in the explanation of the universe that is Samoin. And so so if we think of the A, the going forth, as the father, and the O as the mother, well, then the logical next step would seem to be the child, which it is. It's the synthesis. It's the synthesis between the mother and the father, between the going forth and the receptivity. And so, in teaching man about this in the Tablet of Samoin, the third cycle of creation, the third cycle of anything, it has to do with synthesis. It has to do, but early man's not going to understand what synthesis is, but he does understand what it means to have the male and the female joined together, because that's what the symbol of Esk, the third symbol in Samoin, looks like. And so corporeally we can look out, we can see the horizon. Yep, it's there. There's our horizon. And we can see that, well, all right, the sky is touching the earth there, the there. So they're joined at that point. They're joined. And so he knows, corporeal man knows, that the sky and earth are together as one. And so that's the third combination. As it was explained to mortals, you have your foundation and you have the canopy over it. Or we can think of it nowadays as you have your foundation, and then you have your overseeing of it, your overlooking of it, your overview of it, and then you have the whole together as a unit. Well, this synthesis we could call the first child of the going forth and the O, the receptivity. And this child was taught at the time of Zarathustra. This child was taught. Man was taught what had the name Vavanho or Vavanho, which means expression, the good expression. So the first of men and good men and good women was Vavanho, good expression of the light. It can get a lot deeper than that because we have the the going forth, and so it was taught at the time of Zarathustra. So that this was also the soul of all, the ghost of all, and that was the Father, Jehovah, Ormazd, the master of all light. That's Ormazd, the master of all light. And risen above the light, within the light, understanding the light, everywhere with the light, that's the master of light. And the master light himself, Ormazd. So the Father was all those things, and then the mother gave form to all those going forth, so that when the Father went forth creating things with the foundation, then the mother would allow those things, would take those things and allow them to form, so that womb, in a sense, the O is in a way like a womb where form can manifest. Those what forms? Well, those forms that are there in the foundation, and so are inherent in the foundation. And so we were taught through Zarathustra that the mother then was the seen and the unseen bodies, the seen and unseen forms. That was her domain. And then you had expression, which is the child, the synthesis of those two. And that's the third combination. So in a way now, if you think of what we've just expressed, you have the foundation, that's love, the going forth is love, the wisdom, the overseeing, overviewing, and then you have the synthesis, the power. So the power to accomplish, the power to do things. Take away the canopy, and you lose air, you lose oxygen. Take away, the abstractness and all that, and you lose loft, the capacity to get things done, and you lose the foundation. If you get too high up here, and you lose the foundation, and you lose power. You can't really, ability to accomplish diminishes, and so you have to have right there where they join, where the rubber hits the road, as they say sometimes. Anyway, so that's the third cycle. So in this third cycle, another thing that goes on, if we're thinking about this in terms of, say, generations of men or spells, which are 33 years according to Oahspe and other prophets, we can look at the first spell as being the the foundation spell, the second spell as being the O spell, and the third as the Isk, or the power, and or synthesis spell. And so when looking at history at these things, we can see certain things that go on during these times in relationship to these cycles. And so in the third cycle, essentially it becomes like a reassertion of the foundation. It has to happen often, that with mortal man anyway, that you have to reassert the foundation, because you're going from the foundation to the O to the abstract, and then you have to sort of reassert the foundation to get them to join and everything like that. And that's what the third cycle does. Now, I want to mention in regard to this and what it has to do with numbers per se, is because numbers are just an abstraction of symbols, not of symbols, of cycles. And that's all count is too, is a repetition of cycles. And so you count one apple, okay, that's one. And then the second apple, well, that's just a repetition. That's the second cycle of an apple. Apple 2, third apple, apple 3, and the fourth cycle, apple 4, and so forth. Or days, you can go by days. Well, that was one day the sun came around, 2 days it came around. So that's all dealing with cycles. And what numbers are, then they, at some point man abstracted and said, well, okay, you know, I've got 1 apple, 2 apple, 3 apple, 4 apple, 5 apple, and I could see a connection there, or he was shown the connection initially by inspired with it through Jehovah's angels. Those 5 things with 5 mouths to feed, right? There's 5 people in my family, and so they could see a correspondence. They could see, and so ultimately at some point they abstracted the number 5 and understood that it was 5 units of something, and wouldn't necessarily know what those units were. It could be apples, it could be 5 days, it could be 5 members of a family, it could be 5 tribes, it could be 5 trees, it could be 5 of anything. But so numbers are just abstracted cycles. That's all the numbers are. And so when we talk about number 1, whenever we see number 1, we're talking about the foundation cycle. Same when what we see number 2 is we're seeing that cycle recurring, that foundation recurring, except at a higher level, the O level, and so forth. And the third one is like the third cycle. Number 3 is the third cycle. Number 4 is, and so that's the connection between numbers and cycles, and how we can work from the abstract numbers to cycles, but we can also work from cycles to the abstract numbers, because they're essentially the same thing. One is with units and the other is without units. It's just an abstract unit that it's working with, or a non-spoken unit. When we get to the next one, explanation, the next condition of the universe, of creation, the next cycle, we should say, is the Isak, is what it's called in Oahspe. Now the third combination was called Esk, and that was with the sky and the foundation. But now the fourth one, okay, that's called Cosmos, is the word that we use today, Isak. We could still use that, it still has that soul vibration. But how do we get there? What does it mean? Essentially, the fourth cycle represents the sort of opposite just of the third, even as the second was the opposite of the first. And so because there's always cycles within cycles, and so you can count by twos. Oh yes, there's 2, and then there's 4. Well, this 4 is just like that 2. You know, the first is to the second, as the third is to the fourth. And so the opposite of that, the opposite of it, you could think of it as a flip, and it becomes the cosmos. Now the cosmos is integrative. It integrates everything. The universe, that's the universe, that's everything. It's all of creation. It's all together as one. It's a whole. It's a cosmos. Everything is in harmony within it, if it's one with Jehovah and Jehovah's body, his body being corporea, his physical body being all corporea everywhere, and he has a spiritual body, all spirit everywhere, all atmospheria, and he has a soul body, an Ethereal body, just like we have all those things, because we're like the end product of him, or like this spark that came from him, and we're like, we have a little bit of him within us, And I won't go through all the talk that I've gone through before in other presentations talking about the Great Spirit here, but essentially what we're saying here is that when we're talking about cosmos, we're not talking just about the physical cosmos. Yes, the physical cosmos for the mortal man, for the corporeal mind, it consists of all the corporeal things that you see. But even there, man knows that there's some unseen things that are a part of the cosmos. He knows that thoughts are not seen, but they're a part of this cosmos, part of this living that we're doing. So is sound, so is light, and wind. So, but in the cosmos integrates all this into a whole. See, well, now, what do we do as a project? If we've made a project as our foundation, whatever project it is that we're doing, and we get to the fourth cycle of the fourth stage, or the fourth step, or the fourth phase, however you'd like to call it, but each project goes through these. When we get to the fourth cycle, the fourth stage, the fourth step, the fourth phase, that's where everything gets integrated into a whole, and it becomes, and we try to keep it harmonious. If our foundation is off, then it's going to be more difficult to integrate things. It's going to be more difficult to sustain the harmony, to sustain the whole thing. That's one of the features that we look for, like in generations, spells, or any other cycles that we look at of any length. They'll all have these phases to them, these four phases, to create sort of like a cosmos. But it's not complete. It's not complete yet. Completeness doesn't come until the 10th cycle, and we'll get to that later. But and we can think of it this way, because you right now, you're a whole person. You're a whole, because that's what fourth is. It deals with a whole. You're a whole person, but you're not complete yet. But you are a whole person. See, so that's the difference between wholeness and completeness. And so you try to keep it whole, you try to keep it together, harmonious and all that, with regard to this fourth phase, this fourth cycle. And because man is faulty on his foundation, what normally happens during the fourth phase is he can't hold it all together. Cracks start to form in his social order, if we're talking about a social order. Or if we're talking about a project, as cracks start appearing in his project, it starts falling apart, and he starts losing control of it. And so he has to really, scramble. And so the thing we have to remember about these cycles too is, even though they're conditions, that, and I'm giving forth the higher conditions here, there's also, a person can respond to that negatively, can respond in the way of the beast, so that in the foundation, instead of coming forth in love, one goes forth in the beast. One can go forth with anger, with hatred, in darkness, in ignorance, in selfishness, in war, all these things. You see, and that type of foundation is like the antithesis of love. And so, the same with wisdom. A person doesn't have to be wise when they're acting; they could be foolish. And the same with power. They instead of being potent and ability to accomplish, they could be fall victim to Belial, the worthlessness tract. So instead of being harmonious, it could be extremely inharmonious. And instead of being integrative, it could be disintegrative. And so, toward the end of a social period, this often happens, that all these cracks start appearing, and it gets more difficult to hold everything together. Well, where do you go after the fourth one? Well, the fourth one, actually, essentially you get a new foundation. You're starting over again, but not quite starting over again. You don't need to go through all that again. But the going forth was the outer manifestation, the outer foundation. Well, the fifth is the vertical, the Iaio, the upright, and that actually represents the spiritual foundation or the unseen foundation. And so now it becomes time for man to work on the unseen, whereas over here it was with that which was outwardly manifested. Now it's that which is inwardly manifested. And so what will happen is with the cosmos, as far as the social order goes, we can say, for example, that we have you either have revolution, or you have renaissance, or you have a coup d'etat. Something will happen, or it'll fall into hell and have to be rescued. Fall into anarchy and lawlessness and all that. So, so what the Iaio does is the Iaio sets a new foundation. I like to call it the elevator sometimes, because at the Iaio, it says in WASPI, the downward forever, the upward forever. So there's no theoretical limit as we rise and descend, but there is a practical limit. We can only rise so far or fall so low before something will happen and it will change, and that's sort of represented, I suppose, one could say, by the circle surrounding it, that it encompasses it like a womb.